Well, welcome to In the Valley of Novelty. I see familiar faces, unfamiliar faces. These things are most interesting, at least to me, when they're directed by the agendas of whoever's present. I have a number of things on my mind, more than a weekend's worth of stuff. All of it is very familiar to me. I know what I think, most of the time. So, don't be afraid to interrupt, to ask questions. If you're not getting what you want, it's fine to take it another direction. The way I conceive of these things and how they've evolved over the years is originally my enthusiasm was for informing people about the psychedelic experience, especially plants, and how that arose out of shamanism and how it was evidence for Jungian models of the psyche, and basically, for me, the psychedelic experience was the path to revelation. It actually worked on somebody who thought nothing would work, and that's still a large part of what gets talked about in these weekends, simply because there's an endless crop of new people who are interested in using these botanical materials for purposes of self-exploration, and doing that safely, sanely, and in a fully aware manner involves coordinating a lot of detail: botanical, chemical, ethnographic, geographical, evolutionary, biological, pharmacological detail, which we can spend as much time on as the group will tolerate. What I like to talk about, and what I have very little competition in terms of talking about, is the content of the psychedelic experience, which is very difficult to English or to bring into any other language, and which is not predictable or is confounding of the expectations of students of mystical experience. And so that was sort of my core specialty, if you will, was the ethnopharmacology of consciousness and the phenomenology of the states there derived. But after 25 or 30 years of doing this, it bleeds into all kinds of larger categories, like what is art, what is human history, what is the religious impulse, what is the erotic impulse, what is mathematics, and then somehow these concerns, shamanic, oracular, ecstatic, always garner to themselves a prophetistic aura. What is the future? And can it be known? And is it mundane? Or is it transcendental? And on what scale? And on what schedule? So all of these things are interesting to me. My personal history, if it matters, I grew up in a very middle-class family in a very small town on the western slopes of Colorado, which is about as white bread culture as you can possibly achieve. It was a very stable environment to be brought up in. It was the 50s. It was all tube furniture and bad television, but the ground I happened to be fortunate enough to walk around on had clamshells 150 million years old scattered through it, dinosaur bones, extinct fishes, And as a kid, I was a loner, and I spent a lot of time in these dry arroyos and washes where these fossils and stuff could be found. And then, people informed me of the age of these things. And I can remember when I found out that 1,000,000 years is 1,000 years, 1,000 times. It was like I got it. It was the largest thing I could get at that stage of my conceptualizing reality. But then suddenly the reality of the size and scale of nature snapped into focus for me. And I've been thinking about this recently because one of the things you'll find out about me if we get to know each other is I have a skeptical and cranky side, and I'm forever puzzled by why people believe some of the seeming to me dumb things that they choose to believe. And I spend a lot of time thinking about what is a dumb thing to believe, and how do you judge in a shrilly competing ideological marketplace the various claims, counterclaims, nostrums, ideologies, therapies, insights, revelations that are being peddled. And so my intellectual development, if you want to put it like that, was sort of scientific, in the sense that it was always about looking at phenomena, testing it, trying to define its limits. The strange thing that happened to me, because I guess I eventually became involved with psychedelics, was this method of testing, demanding proof, never taking anything for granted. Normally what that does is it deflates reality. It flattens it. It makes it industrial and existential and post-romantic and horrifying. But in my case, it didn't, because psychedelics are actually a kind of miraculous reality that can stand the test of objective examination. In other words, there's nothing woo-woo about it. It has to do with perturbing states of brain chemistry and standing back and observing the effects they're wrought thereby. And it's extremely dependable. And from a medical point of view, it's extremely safe and non-invasive. One of the paradoxes of pharmacology is that the substances which most dramatically affect the mind do so at tiny doses and with very little sequela. This is extraordinary. It's almost as though the mind, in this case, is a phenomenon very different from the body, where to achieve major effects in the body, often massively invasive procedures or large doses of invasive chemicals have to be used. Someone once said to me, referring to LSD, that if you wanted a picture at the molecular level of the power of LSD, imagine an ant that can rip the Empire State Building apart in 30 minutes. One ant. In terms of the scales and the sizes of what's going on, that's a reasonable analogy to the power of LSD. So I explored all kinds of fringe areas when I was a kid, magic and telepathy and Ouija boards and various invocations, some of which interrupted my career as an altar boy. Couldn't have it both ways, it turned out. And one by one, these things fell, in the same way that as you go through life, you close the door on Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and so forth and so on as you move along toward adulthood. But then I discovered that the psychedelic dimension seemed to be an exception, that it was as though the tidy world of European positivist culture derived from Calvinism and Greek science and so forth and so on had this umbilical point, this place where it was all tied together. And if you untied it completely deflated, and you were left staring into something analogous to William James' description of an infant's world. You were left staring into a blooming, buzzing confusion. Well, what is that? What are the implications of that? It wasn't a confusion chaotic enough to be simply mind dissipated into thermodynamic noise. I think a lot of people who have never taken psychedelics have the idea that it's thermodynamic noise, that it's just the brain isn't working right, it's firing randomly, and then some portion of it is trying desperately to lay gestalts of meaning onto this random firing, and so you get this kind of surreal careening from one supposed illusionary perception to another. Anybody who's taken psychedelics knows this is not a very apt or cogent description, that actually these things reveal scenarios, modalities, hierophanies of emotional and poetic power that are very emotionally moving, and sometimes leave in their wake powerful ideas as powerful as any of the ideas that have moved and shaped civilization. So my motivation in talking about these things is that I do not say that this is the only path out of the mundane coil of blind casuistry and entropic degradation. I don't say it's the only path out. It's the only path I found. And I checked some of the other major players, but checking doesn't mean I exhausted them. I mean, perhaps yoga can deliver this. Perhaps Mahayanist metaphysics can deliver these things. Perhaps I was impatient or lumpen or simply not intelligent enough. But the good news about psychedelics is that they are incredibly democratic. Even the clueless can be swept along if the dose is sufficient. Yes. Well, so that's just a little bit about it. And other things that are very interesting to me, as I said, are the future, but the future in some specificity, both the rationally apprehendable future that we get when we extrapolate current technologies, current tendencies, and the not so rationally apprehendable future when we actually turn on all the bells and whistles of the historical process and realize that it is inevitably ramping up into more and more hypersonic states of self-expression, and that this is what is creating this end of history phenomenon, or this eschatological intimation that now haunts the cultural dialogue. There is something deep and profound moving in the mass psyche, driven by historical forces long in the process of unfolding, but now exacerbated and focused by new communications technologies that are essentially prostheses, extensions of the human mind and body of enormous and unpredictable power, or with unpredictable consequences. So, in a sense, what began for me as the psychedelic experience, a personal experience triggered by a relationship with a plant based on certain definable pharmacological phenomena has become like a general metaphor for understanding being in the world and our historical dilemma, because in a way they're fractal adumbrations of each other. I mean, history, call it 15,000 or 25,000 years of duration, is the story of an animal, some kind of complex animal, becoming conscious and staring out then into a kind of universe of infinite possibilities based on what consciousness can do in the realm of energy, matter, light, time, and space. Well, so in a way, the psychedelic experience is like a microcosmic reflection of that. You start from baseline, which is your ordinary lumpen or not so lumpen, depending on who you are, state of consciousness, but wherever you start from, it lifts you up in a process of evolutionary unfoldment that is squeezed into hours, and it goes on entirely in the evolution of thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. And it seemed to me for a long time, at least since I read McLuhan and assimilated his notion of tools as things which have a feedback into how we see the world, it seemed to me that the psychedelic state was then like a predictive model for what human history wanted to do. Human history wants to break through all boundaries, to somehow have a realized collective relationship with deity, or that which orders nature, or some fairly large concept like that. Yeah, the implications. It's all in the implications. It has to do with how much intelligence you bring to it at the beginning. You know, if there's no mind behind the retinal screen, then it's just pyrotechnics, mental pyrotechnics. But it's how much we can make of the phenomenon that makes it so rich. Yeah, you mentioned the gratuitous grace. This is based on a famous comment by Aldous Huxley. He was asked at one point, what is the psychedelic experience? And he said it's a gratuitous grace. And then he explained it is neither necessary for salvation nor sufficient for salvation. But it certainly makes it easier. You know, it's like an aid. It's a cul-de-sac. I mean, we can't suppose that it's necessary for salvation because too many people have gone from birth to the grave without it. But one has attained a very fortunate incarnation, I think, to be in a culture, in a place, in a time when psychedelic knowledge is available. And it's a kind of paradox that in our own time, meaning in the last 100 years, all this information has arrived in our laps as the hubristic enterprise of white man anthropology carried back all these medicine kits and mojo bags and sacred plants and so forth and grew them in university botanical gardens and kept the stuff in locked drawers. It was like a Trojan horse brought inside the city walls of Calvin's Troy. And, now the genie is out of the bottle. I'll have to restrain myself for these long exegetical comments on each person's... Yeah. Yeah, I'm interested in all of this, too, the rising paranoia and what it means and how to come to terms with what I call the balkanization of epistemology, the fact that the world isn't, large groups of people no longer demand that the world even makes sense. They're operating operating on synthetic ontologies that have risen above the concept of mere sense. But, there's a whiff of fascism about that has to be fully deconstructed before we want to sign up. Yeah. Well, I have answers for all three of your questions, but it would take a while to unfold it. But as far as this last question is concerned, the official answer is because it came with the conquest. That the Stropharia cubensis, the Psilocybe cubensis, only prefers the dung of Bos indicus cattle. So it was so associated with the cultural genocide brought by the Spanish conquerors. And this is the same reason given why in Mexico, though there are, in the Mexican situation it's a little different, you actually have an indigenous population of native mushrooms, but you also have the San Isidro, the cubensis, but it's considered inferior when it isn't by any chemical index. So I think it's a deep association to the conquest is the only thing I can figure. The other thing may be, and this is that I gave you the official answer, then here's an answer based on my own experience. Though I know that some people combine harmine with psilocybin, when I have done it, it has scared the socks off me. It seems an unfriendly combination for me. Now, the way I did it was I took half a dose of ayahuasca and half a dose of mushrooms. Do not do this. If you must combine these two compounds, I think the way you want to do it is take a fairly substantial dose of an MAO inhibitor, either Pergamon harmala seeds or the Banisteriopsis, and a very light amount of mushrooms. But the 50-50 combination was one of the longest evenings I've ever spent. And if I seem not to be going to answer your other two questions in the course of the weekend, remind me, because, I'm keen to get to both of those. Yeah. Community and connection. Yeah, it's important for all of you to notice everyone who's here, because our agenda has triumphed so completely culturally that we can't tell ourselves from the rest of the population as we could in the 60s. So it's only at moments like this when we emerge out of the darkness and show ourselves to each other. And I will sail on to the next New Age watering hole or institute or whatever. But you should all realize that probably whatever you're looking for, someone in this room could help you out if you could but figure out exactly who it is and what it is you're looking for. Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned the Kundalini thing, because those of you who've read my book, The Invisible, True Hallucinations, know that my brother and I got into something that was triggered by psychedelics and started out as a psychedelic trip, but then developed into either an episode of schizophrenia or a revelation, or it depended on who was voting. And this can happen. These things are, the path goes further than most sojourners wish to travel, I think. I mean, the power is immense. And once you find the way, it isn't a matter of, it can be overwhelming. Someone once said the yogin and the schizophrenic are divers in the same ocean, but one of them has learned how to use scuba equipment and the other is simply drowning. So the reason for the emphasis on shamanism and on other techniques is you will need techniques if you go into the deep water. can make your life very simple and save you from unnecessary suffering. Not all suffering is necessary. Maybe no suffering is necessary. Yeah, one of the things that I'm keen to talk to you about is, there are various models of the psychedelic experience, that it's the Jungian unconscious, that it's the ancestor world, that it's this or that. The one that I'm most struck by is it's the world of the Platonic ideals. It's a world very closely related to mathematics. And in a way, the shaman is a hyper-mathematician, not in that he proposes theorems and solves them, but that he perceives hyperdimensionally. And the magical power of the shaman, the power to predict weather, to tell where the game has gone, to cure, to have deep insight into social problems within the tribal group. All these so-called magical powers become completely understandable if you believe that the shaman actually attains a kind of hyperdimensional perception. And, also teaching here this weekend is my old buddy Ralph Abraham, who's one of the world's leading exponents of chaos dynamics, and he has told me many times that the DMT flash for him is simply and straightforwardly a perception of hyperspace, a coordination, and this is why metaphors like inner eye and inner seeing make sense, because of course in hyperspace the inside of the body is no more secret from perception than the outside of the body. So, mathematics is one of the few things I still trust at this point. Yeah, that's my motivation, is based basically on curiosity. I'm fascinated that we've gotten this far. Given that the most economical situation would be pure nothingness, what is this? Why is nature doing these things? And why is organization have such a tenacity? And what does it mean that we appear so late in the process and represent such a difference in the rest of nature? It's very mysterious. We get used to reality because it's so stable, but in fact it's an absolutely confounding situation. Besides the DMT flash, the only other thing that I know that's as confounding as that is ordinary consciousness and incarnate being in a body. It's just so improbable. Yeah, well, I was very resonant with the person over here who mentioned Evelyn Underhill's book on mysticism, because I also read it at about that age, and I wanted these mystical experiences. The problem is that the thing that is so powerful about the psychedelics is that they perform on demand, which almost in principle you cannot expect of a mystical experience, because that would be essentially man ordering God at man's whim, which is not how it's supposed to work. Similarly, waiting for UFOs to come by, you spend a lot of cold nights in the cornfield. But if you were to take 5 dried grams of Stropharia cubensis and spend the night in the cornfield, I don't know whether you would get UFOs, but I guarantee you by morning your notebook would be full of something. So the fascinating thing about the psychedelic is, of all of the, it seems magical in the sense that it seems to respond to human will. One decides whether this is the evening or not. And sometimes people have said to me, well, don't you want to achieve these things on the natch? Well, to me that suggests a certain degree of out-of-controlness. In other words, if I were sitting here suddenly to notice that I appeared to have taken 20 milligrams of psilocybin, I would be alarmed. I would be concerned. I would want to know the casuistry of why I felt this way, whether somebody had dosed me at dinner or I was losing my mind or what was going on. On the other hand, if I had initiated the experience, I would be perfectly at ease with it and see the unfolding signposts and know what it was. It's a difference of sort of waiting in an attitude of the supplicant, the expectant supplicant, or being the hierophant with all the Faustian echoes that carries with it, and being able to call down the power or go up to the power at will. And, that's a fantastic thing and a responsibility. One of the things that inevitably downloads out of all this psychedelic stuff is, because it's central to understanding our nature anyway, is how do we relate to our sexuality, to our relationships, to our obligations to biology and romanticism and so forth and so on. And you mentioned monotony, monogamy, and monotheism, or was that the one? Well, part of what happens with a career like mine is everything you ever say is taped. So then your ideas may change over time, but people will listen to an 8-year-old tape, a 6-year-old tape, and so you're like imprisoned or liberated, I haven't figured out which, because you must account for every opinion you ever held, even if you no longer hold it. The toughest thing to figure out is relationships. It is the yoga of the West, but it's harder than yoga. I'm 52 nearly, and I don't feel greatly wiser in this area than I felt at 24. And, I've had a marriage, I've had a divorce, I've been single, I've had long-term relationships, short-term relationships, on and on and on. This is part of what I'll say in a larger context is we shouldn't seek for closure. We shouldn't, part of what the psychedelic point of view represents is living a certain portion of your life without answers, just accepting that certain dilemmas will never resolve themselves into some kind of a complete answer. That's why psychedelics are so different from any system being sold, from one of the great elder systems like Christianity to the latest cult out of Los Angeles. These cults, these cultic answers, always invariably provide a complete set of answers to life's dilemmas at the price of being absurd, but this doesn't seem to bother people. So part of what being psychedelic means, I think, is relentlessly living with unanswered questions. And this relationship thing, this is the heart of the alchemical furnace. This is where the coincidentia positorum is a fact in your life and my life. And I don't know whether psychedelics make it easier or harder to come to terms with that. They certainly reveal its many facets with incredible and sometimes bewildering clarity. It's a frustrating situation because the literature tells you that DMT occurs widely throughout nature, distributed through grasses, mammalian brain tissue, leguminous trees, rubiaceous plants, but when you actually go to try and get it out, you encounter two problems. Either it's spread very thin, or, and that's the, if it's spread thin by simply gross overwhelmment, you can get it out. But the other problem is it often occurs complexed with other tryptamines of very nearly the same molecular weight, and they have activity you don't want, cardioactive activity or like that. So practically speaking, in my own experience, the cleanest source of DMT is Secotria viridis. And if you can get hold of it and grow it, you will obtain a clean source of DMT. But you need 5 acres in a tropical country to do it right. That's why I have 5 acres in a tropical country. What? Well, it is Schedule 1. Pardon me? Yeah, all DMT is Schedule 1, but there's a weird catch-22 around that. I mean, we all contain DMT. So, it's like the universal holding law. Everybody's holding. Everybody is potentially out from under the umbrella. Probably, though you may not wish to hear this, the shortcut, the easier path, is to just tighten your belt and learn organic chemistry and make it then from scratch, or, from tryptophan or indole or something. But it's a puzzle why there is so little DMT, because as a synthetic process, it's not that difficult. It's certainly far less difficult than making LSD or something like that. But it's vanishingly rare in the underground. One reason for that may be, if you sell somebody a gram, they may leave a significant portion of it to their great-grandchildren. This is not a drug of abuse, where what people like are drugs where you sell somebody a gram at 8 in the evening and at 11 o'clock they're beating on your door to buy 2 more. This is not like that. It is... You mean, what is it doing there? It's not really well understood. The people who identified it, their best guess was that it had something to do with very rapid shifts of short-term attention. In other words, a shot is fired, everyone in the room turns and looks in well under a second. That is possibly, those shifts of attention are mediated by DMT. The fact that it is so dramatic as a psychedelic experience but goes away so quickly makes it an ideal chemical to use in these kinds of short-term reactions where something spikes and then very rapidly returns to its baseline. But what it's really doing in human metabolism, we don't know. DMT, like many psychedelics, competes with serotonin for the serotonergic bond site. Interesting then that drugs like Prozac and Zoloft, these new antidepressants, they also relate to, though in a different way, the serotonergic system, one of the 4 major neurotransmitter systems that operates in the human brain. It's no surprise to me that these extremely effective antidepressants are emerging out of meddling with serotonergic chemistry. DMT, many people experience it as orgasmic or ecstatic. Ecstasy is not simply joy. Ecstasy is an emotion of very great complexity that hovers almost on the edge of terror sometimes. But, we could speculate that the orgasm is an interesting phenomenon, and what is the chemical basis of orgasm, and why does it occur at all? Since in many animals it doesn't occur. And in fact, as you advance in the animal phylogeny, orgasm becomes more common. Well, I would bet that the chemistry of orgasm, the chemistry of DMT, the chemistry of mood alteration, in the next 5 or 10 years, this will all be pieced, deconstructed and understood. I mean, the recent flap about Viagra will be as nothing when a drug is discovered which causes orgasm. And chemically, this is probably not far out of reach. Orgasm is a pretty general spectrum chemical response that you ought to be able to pharmacologically mimic with reasonable facility. I'm sure some of our best people at our pharmaceutical companies are hard at work on this. Yeah, but I digress.
McKenna, and my training is basically in shamanism and botany and ethnography. And my interest is in hallucinogenic drugs, especially plant hallucinogens as they're used in a shamanic context. And what impels me to speak to a room full of people like this is the belief that the major important point regarding hallucinogens has been largely overlooked, even though we're now 15 or 20 or 30, depending on how you count it, years into the psychedelic age. The central point about the psychedelic experience is the content of the experience. And this has been occluded or obfuscated by the behavioral and statistical and scientific methods that have been brought to bear to study hallucinogenic experience. So what I'm going to address this evening is essentially my own experience with hallucinogens and how I extrapolate it into the world based on its own being and other people's psychedelic experiences that I have interacted with. Before I get into that, I want to clarify something about shamanism. There are two schools about the basis of shamanism, shamanistic experience. One is the older school exemplified by Mircea Eliade, who holds that all narcotic shamanism is decadent. He prefers drumming, dancing, self-mutilation, even ordeal poisons, all precede the efficacy of hallucinogens. He believes they are resorted to when the tradition is vitiated and people are grasping at straws. I take this to be simply a cultural bias of the school of anthropology that he exemplified and the time in which his work was done. Now, Gordon Wasson has taken the opposite tack and takes the position that non-narcotic shamanism is decadent because it is on its way to becoming ritual. In other words, drumming, fasting, flagellation, all these things work to a degree and sometimes, and they are not dependable in the same way that hallucinogens are. And this has created this plays on Western people's biases in favor of the idea that you have to work hard to get somewhere, and if you don't work hard, it isn't useful. My own experience in looking at non-narcotic shamanism, essentially non-narcotic shamanism in Indonesia and in Nepal, was that Wasson's intuition was very correct. There is a grasping after, and I see that grasping after blending into the evolution of all higher religions. In other words, experientially, there is only one religion, and it is shamanism and shamanic ecstasy. But it is very difficult to maintain in an agrarian context. Hunting and gathering societies, which have much less structured social hierarchies, seem to be able to function with the hallucinogenic experience embedded in them. As soon as you rise even to the level of primitive agriculturalists, it becomes much more important to be able to get up in the morning and go to work than it does to have these ecstatic experiences, because the plants have to be tended, the fields tilled, and so on. I formed these opinions about non-narcotic shamanism early in my career of looking at this phenomenon. I didn't contact narcotic shamanism until I went to the Amazon basin, initially in 1971. And although I was familiar with the hallucinogenic state from growing up basically in the counterculture in Berkeley, but what I found in South America after sifting through these various experiences is that the family of drugs constellated around tryptophan, specifically DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and psilocybin, which is chemically very similar to DMT, that these compounds had a relationship to reality far different from all the other hallucinogens. The scopolamine, hyoscyamine, tropane family that you get in datura and that kind of thing, or LSD, which laboratory LSD does not occur in nature, but isomers of it occur in nature, although to be taken at hallucinogenic doses, they must be taken at hundreds of times the amount. So that's basically the scientific, medical, anthropological basis of what I'm saying. A career spent in Asia and more recently in the Amazon looking at this phenomenon. And I want to take my conclusions tonight and contrast them with the modern predicament and try to make a model using the hallucinogenic experience, a model that makes some of the anxieties of being human, and especially some of the anxieties of being human in the 20th century context, more palatable. And to do that, I want to evoke a number of abysses, a number of empty places that our minds tend normally to shy away from. First to invoke them, and then to integrate them through the idea of what is conventionally called the UFO, or the UFO experience. These abysses are basically four embedded in a fifth. The four are the biological abyss that is represented by death and dying, that is the central crisis of every individual existence, and almost as a reflection of that crisis on a higher plane, the historical abyss represented by the end of history and the apocalypse and possibly the millennium, but in any case, the end of history that Western religion, whether it be Judaism, Christianity, or whatever, has appointed to our world and made basic to Western man's view of things, and which now, because of the existence of nuclear weapons and this kind of thing, poses a terminal threat to the culture. So, two abysses, the biological and the historical, the latter being symbolized in the apocalyptic crisis. A third abyss could be called the psychological, and this is represented by dreams, most in general experience, and by hallucinogens. It is this casting off from the moorings of the ego, making the night sea journey into the other, and being at the mercy of, call it the collective unconscious, the overmind of the species, what have you. The fourth abyss, which is one whose emergence is unique in our time, is the actual physical abyss which surrounds this planet for light years in all directions, because suddenly now, because of our level of technology and scientific mapping, we realize that it is there, and we realize that it is a source of our cosmic loneliness, and we realize that it presents an immense challenge of the sort we like to accept as a Western culture, challenges of energy, engineering, and distance. So these are the four abysses: the abyss of space, the abyss of death, the abyss of the psychedelic experience, and the abyss of dying. And these four general categories have to be seen embedded in a somewhat subtler kind of abyss, which is the abyss of the unspeakable. In other words, that language, which is the primary tool of cognition of the species, casts nets against these other gulfs and comes away with different kinds of maps. But you cannot put much trust in these maps unless you've carried out a thorough analysis of language. And once you've done that, for sure you will not put much trust in any of these maps, because the thinness of the web on which it all is hung will be readily apparent. Okay. It's my assumption whenever I am confronted with opposites is to try to unify them, to create a coincidentia positorum, as was done in alchemy, to not force the system to closure, but to try and leave the system open enough so that the differences can resonate and become complementary rather than antithetical. So I would like to unify here not two dualisms, but these four oppose, these pairs. You could think of them as the quadripartite elements of a kind of mandala. The means to unifying that mandala is integration of the psychedelic experience. Specifically, I'm going to make the assumption, specifically the psilocybin or tryptamine experience. And what it appears to be is something which is much more assimilable to the science fiction metaphor of a parallel universe than it is to the Freudian metaphor of the repression of desire, or even the Jungian metaphor of a collective species-wide memory and experience bank. It is much more, I think, of the character of a parallel continuum. And in order to erect the intellectual edifice of the past 1,000 years, this possibility has had to be ignored, much in the way that you would apply Occam's razor to a situation and just say, well, we will not admit the more complex phenomenon because we should form a theory that is true to the simplest phenomena first and then build out from it. And this has worked in a demonic kind of way, in the sense that we have taken command of the atomic world, which is a very simple world compared, for instance, to the variables that you meet in sociology or biology, but at the cost of formulating theories about how the world is put together that nowhere come tangential to experience. So we have a bizarre situation where our best models of reality that are kept for us by the priesthood of science are like exhibits in a museum because they cannot be mapped on to the simple fact of individual experience. Shamanism, on the other hand, is this worldwide, since Paleolithic times, tradition which says that you must make your own experience the centerpiece of any model of the world that you build. No amount of readings from meters, whether they're metering cyclotrons or any other kind of instrument, are going to satisfy you. Once you understand that, then what the task becomes is one of making sense of these metaphors, so-called, or myths, so-called, that are the pre-Western, pre-print, pre-literate mappings of the world. An example of how this problem distorts other problems is the problem of extraterrestrial contact, which is the way science presents the problem of extraterrestrial contact is that we are alone, and that to assuage our cosmic loneliness, we should build ever larger radio telescopes and million-channel signal analyzers and sift the radio noise coming from the stars. And eventually, if a signal is found, an immense philosophical turning point will have occurred, and we will then place ourselves in the context of the cosmos. This is actually a red herring kind of argument, because outside of the highly technical Western societies that have evolved in the last 300 years, people have been talking to the other since man began. Angels, demons, fairies, sprites, elves, all of this is as phenomenologically a part of human experience as, we'll say, birds of paradise, which I'm sure none of you have ever had anything to do with, but believe inflexibly that such creatures exist because it is allowed by the experts that they exist. What psilocybin focuses as a problem that these other hallucinogens do not is it allows a dialogue with the other that is full of give and take. In other words, there are entities in the hallucinogenic world that psilocybin and DMT and a few other not well known or widely distributed plant hallucinogens induce. I think it was William Blake who said, the truth cannot be told so as to be understood without being believed. And this is the kind of information that is coming through the psilocybin experience. It is information which you have to believe it. You have to believe it because it has this ring of authenticity. It is the logos. It is the word somehow. And what is being said is that our alienation, and this word is interesting, alienation, our alienation from ourselves has caused us to set up a number of straw men that are keeping us from building actually a mature model of how the universe really works. The content of the dialogue with the other is a content that indicates that man's horizons are infinitely bright, that death is in fact, as Thomas Vaughan put it, the body is the placenta of the soul. And this fact has not yet been assimilated because it runs counter to Western reductionist, materialist empiricism. But this idea that the body is placenta to the soul is not an object of faith or a dogma. It's a program for activity. The activity that it implies should be undertaken is a familiarization with the soul. And the soul has been banned from Western thinking about the self for nigh on 400 years, at least in leading circles. But I take this concept very seriously. And I think if any of you are familiar with the literature of alchemy, alchemy is about the generation of a psychic construct, a wholeness, a thing which has many properties, which is paradoxical, which is both mind and matter, which can do anything. This is the last gasp of the soul before it's submerged completely. In other words, it became trapped in an association with chthonic matter in the last historical epoch before it disappeared completely from Western consciousness. Psychedelic drugs, especially psilocybin, allow a searchlight to be thrown on these deeper levels of the psyche, as Jung correctly stated, but it is not a museum of archetypes or psychic constructs, as he seemed to assume. It is a frontier of wholeness into which any person so motivated and so courageous as to wish to do it can go and leave the mundane plane far behind. In other words, it is a dimension of vertical gain that is real and is present in all of our lives, and that we do not acknowledge except as an anomaly because we have been told that it's an anomaly. We have been told that these perceptions have to be devalued. The result of this is to so distort the psychic life of the species in the present historical context that we have this UFO disease, which is essentially a rupture into three-dimensional space of this archetype of wholeness. And it haunts time like a ghost, and it haunts human experience in the 20th century because it is a symbol of alienation. And the word alien has, in fact, come to be applied to this thing. It is alien. It comes from the stars. It is totally non-human. It has great potential for mankind, but it can barely be Englished at all. And actually, what it is the self in the form in which it is most accessible to the ego, given the ego's programming with all this scientific garbage about the density of life in the universe, the distance to the stars, the probability of chemical evolution occurring here and there and yonder. It is, in other words, something which, in order not to alarm us, has disguised itself as an extraterrestrial being, but is in fact the collectivity of the human psyche, signaling a profound historical crisis. I talked about this before. I talked about the danger of succumbing to belief in UFOs because of the damage it did to free will. And that, yes, the UFO is making war on science, because science has created such a masculine overbalance in the intellectual life of the species that this automatic mechanism has been triggered. A history-stopping archetype is being released into the skies of this planet. And if we are not careful, it will halt all intellectual inquiry in the same way that the Christos archetype halted intellectual inquiry in the Hellenistic age. I don't want to go into this too deeply, but it's clear to me that Hellenistic science was destroyed by the Christos archetype because the Democritean atomists and materialists who ran Roman civilization had no patience whatsoever with this superstition that was being circulated among the servants about a man who rose from the dead and all of that went with it. But before they knew what had happened, their whole civilization was in ruin because the archetype had frozen the forward thrust of this masculine, dominant, ethically depotentiated, technologically obsessed, slave-built society. And for 1,000 years, hydrostatics, mathematics, metallurgy, you name it, that was nothing. Only the words of one Galilean radical could occupy the time of any intellectual successfully. Okay, we have now, 2,000 years later, fought our way somewhat clear of that problem. But the problem it solved, which is the problem of this masculine overbalance and this obsessive technological thrust, this dehumanizing thrust, has reached an even more intense peak. And Now appears the flying saucer with the capacity of undoing that by again destroying science, by simply being a miracle. That's all that is required to wreck science, is a miracle visible worldwide. And this, because scientists say that that can't happen. Consequently, if it does happen, their house is in real disorder. So I touched on this before, any of you who heard me. Tonight I want to talk more about the flying saucer, not from the point of view of the people who are going to get the whammy when it appears unbidden, but from the point of view of an insider. In other words, one can do more than simply say, oh yes, I understand what this is. The overmind is visibly manifest in the skies of Earth in order to skew history toward an eschatological mode that will stifle inquiry in order, basically, to preserve the species from extinction. But a mature humanity could get into a place where we no longer required these metaphysical spankings from messiahs and flying saucers that come along every 1,000 years or so to mess up the mess that has been created and to try and send people off on another tack. And the way to do this is to look at the abysses that confront man as species and individual and try to unify them. And I think that psilocybin offers a way out because it allows a dialogue with the overmind that is not, you won't read about it in Scientific American or anywhere else. You will carry it out. And the carrying out of this dialogue will essentially eschatologize you as a person and lift you out of the historical context. It's like Stephen Dedalus said in Ulysses, history is the nightmare that I am trying to awake from. Well, I would turn it around a bit and say history is what I am trying to go to sleep from in order to get away from it. In other words, the dream is eschatological. The dream is zero time and outside of history. Escape into the dream. Escape, a key thing charged against these drugs, that they are for escapists. I think the people who make this charge hardly dare dream to what degree they are escapist. Escape. Escape from the planet, from death, and from the problem, if possible, of the unspeakable. So now, to say a bit about death and dying, if you leave aside the last 300 years of historical experience as it was handled in Europe and America, and examine the phenomenon of death, the doctrine of the soul in all its ramifications, Neoplatonic, Christian, dynastic, Egyptian, etc. I'm sure you're all familiar with some or all of these. What you get is the idea that there is a light body or a thing, an intellect, that is somehow mixed up in the body during life and at death or at dying is involved in a crisis in which these two envelopes separate and one loses its raison d'etre and falls into dissolution, metabolism stops, and the other one goes we know not where. Perhaps nowhere, if you believe it doesn't exist. But then you have the problem of trying to explain life, which, by the way, though science makes great claims and has done very well in systems of nuclear particles and even simple atomic systems, the idea that science can make any statement about what life is or where it comes from is preposterous. Science has nothing to say about how you can decide to close your hand into a fist, and it happens. This is utterly outside the realm of scientific explanation, because what we see in that phenomenon is mind as a first cause. In other words, we see matter. It's an example of telekinesis. Matter is caused by mind to move. So we need not fear the sneers of science in the matter of the fate or origin of the soul. And as I say, my thrust into this has always been the psychedelic experience, but I've been thinking recently more about dreams, because dreams are a much more generalized form of experience of the hyperdimension, or the mnemonic traditions say about dreams. You come to the realization that experientially for those people it is a parallel continuum. The shaman accesses it with hallucinogens or other things which I mentioned, but most efficaciously with hallucinogens. But everybody else accesses it through dreams. Now, Freud's idea about dreams was, I forget the German term, but he called them day residues. He always felt that you could trace the content of the dream down to a distortion of something that happened during the day, or, during waking time. I think that it's much more useful to try and make actually a kind of geometric model of consciousness, and to take serious dream is not a kind of, but a higher order spatial dimension, so that in sleep you are released into the real world, of which the world of waking is only the surface. And in a very literal sense, it's the surface. It's the surface in a geometric sense, that there is a plenum, and recent experiments in quantum physics tend to back this up. There is a holographic plenum of information. All information is everywhere. Information that is not here is nowhere. And that information stands outside of historical time. It's like Plato said, time is the moving image of eternity. Eternity, it does not have a temporal existence, even the kind of temporal existence where you say it always existed. It does not have temporal duration of any sort. It is eternity. We are not primarily biology, with mind emerging as a kind of iridescence, a kind of epiphenomenon at the higher levels of organization of biology. We are, in fact, hyperdimensional objects of some sort which cast a shadow into matter. And the shadow in matter is the body. And at death, what happens, basically, is that the shadow withdraws, or the thing which casts the shadow withdraws, and metabolism ceases, and matter, which had been organized into a dissipative structure in a very localized area, sustaining itself against entropy by cycling material in and degrading it and expelling it, that whole phenomenon ceases. But the thing which ordered it is not affected by that. And when I make these declarative statements, I'm making them from the point of view of this shamanic tradition, which touches all these higher religions. Everything, basically, except rationalism, holds to some version of what I'm saying. So then the psychedelic, the dream state and the psychedelic state acquire great import, because there is then a task to life. And the task to life is to become familiar with this thing which is causing being, and to be familiar with it at the moment of passing. In other words, the metaphor is used by several traditions of a vehicle, an after-death vehicle, an astral body, something like that. And shamanism and certain yogas, Taoist yoga, claim very clearly that the purpose is to familiarize yourself with this after-death body in life. And then the act of dying will not create confusion in the psyche. You will recognize what is happening, you will know what to do, and you will make the clean break. And there does seem to be the possibility of a problem in dying. In other words, what I'm telling you is not that you're condemned to eternal life. I'm saying it's a possibility, but you can muff it through ignorance. In other words, at the moment of death, there is a kind of a separation. It's like birth. The metaphor is trivial but perfect. It is there is a possibility of damage, of incorrect activity. Again, William Blake, who said that as you start into the spiral, there is the possibility of falling from the golden track into eternal death. But it is only a crisis of a moment. It's a crisis of passage. And the whole purpose of shamanism and of life, correctly lived, is to strengthen the soul and to strengthen the relationship to the soul so that this passage can be cleanly made. Okay, this is not anything earth-shaking, or it's well known. It's a traditional position, actually. But now I want to assimilate one more abyss into this model, one less familiar to us as rationalists, but well familiar to us just one level deeper in the psyche as Christians and Westerners, and that is this idea that the world will end, that there will be a final time, that there is not only the crisis of the death of the individual, there is the crisis of the death of the species. What this seems to be about is that from the time that there is an awareness of the existence of the soul, we'll say circa 50,000 BP, until the resolution of the apocalyptic potential, there's something like 50,000 years, which in biological time is only a moment, but it is the entire span of history times 5. In that period, everything hangs in the balance because it is a mad rush from monkeydom to starshiphood. And in the leap across those 25,000 years, energies are released, religions are shot off like sparks, philosophies evolve and die, science arises, magic arises, all of these things which control power with greater and lesser degrees of ethical constancy appear. There is the possibility, as in the metaphor of dying, there is the possibility of mucking it up, of aborting the species transformation into a hyperspatial intellecty. We are now, there can be no doubt that we are now in the final seconds of that crisis, a crisis which involves the end of history, the departure from the planet, the triumph over death, and the release of the individual from matter. We are, in fact, closing distance with the most profound event a planetary ecology can encounter, which is the freeing of life from the dark chrysalis of matter. The old metaphor of psyche as the butterfly is a species-wide metaphor. We must undergo a metamorphosis in order to survive the momentum of the historical forces already in motion. Well, if you know anything about evolutionary biology, you know that man is considered to be an unevolving species. In other words, sometime in the last 100,000 years, with the invention of culture, the biological evolution of man ceased, and evolution became a cultural phenomenon. Tools, languages, and philosophies began to evolve, but the human somotype began to remain the same. And so we are very much like people a long time ago. But technology is the real skin of our species. Man, correctly seen in the context of the last 500 years, is an extruder of a technological shell. We take in matter that has a low degree of organization. We put it through mental filters, and we extrude Lindisfarne Gospels, space shuttles, all of these things. This is what we do. We're like coral animals embedded in a technological reef of extruded psychic objects. And the tool is the flying saucer or the soul exteriorized in three-dimensional space. It's, as James Joyce said, it's the problem of how man may be dirigible, right? And how man may be dirigible is basically by turning himself inside out. In other words, the body must become an interiorized hologrammatic object embedded in a solid-state hyperdimensional matrix which is eternal, so that man wanders through Elysium in his body. This is a kind of Islamic paradise that I'm putting out here. Wanders through Elysium in his body, experiencing all the pleasures of the flesh, but not realizing that he is a holographic projection of a solid-state matrix that is micro-miniaturized, superconducting, and nowhere to be found. It is part of the plenum. And all history is about producing prototypes of this situation with greater and greater closure toward the ideal, so that airplanes, automobiles, condominiums, space shuttles, space colonies, starships of the hardware, speed of light, spin-dizzy drive type, all of these are, as Mr. Leon said,
an interesting phenomenon that occurs as you work into different states of consciousness. That as you come into each new frequency of vibration or each new level of consciousness, you experience extraordinarily increased amounts of energy. Now, often you can't use this energy because you're not open to use it. And therefore what you experience is a fantastic amount of tension build up. And the feeling, I've got to do something, of tension created. In the chakra system, that is because you don't have any vehicles for expression in any chakra above your third chakra. And there's too much energy to be expressed that way.
What is third chakra?
I'm going to tell you. Good. Okay. If you can just think now, and this is all, you can use it as a metaphor, you can use it at any level you want to use it. Think of seven energy centers all in a row, ascending row, from 1 at the bottom to 7 at the top. Muladhara, Svadhisthana, Manipura, Anahata, Vishuddha, Ajna, Sahaswara are the Sanskrit words for them. Now imagine that each of these levels defines a way in which energy can come into the system and a way in which energy can go out of the system. All right? And everything below the number 4, 3 and down, energy can only come into the system through the gross body, through food, etc., like that. Now, taking these 7 steps, now think of this as the thing that goes through the 7 as a river. Okay? And you're going to travel up this river. This river is called the Sushumna. The first place you come to on this river, called the first chakra, is, think of it as being in the middle of a very wild wilderness in Africa. where there are wild animals and you're into a survival concern. Your primary thing is to get roots and nuts and fruit and not be killed by tigers and, right? So that your total preoccupation at that point is with survival of you as a separate entity. Right? It's very much like an ape is like that. Survival of your body. Survival of you as an individual, separate entity in form. And all the energy that you is used to, right, keep you surviving as a separate entity. That's number one. Now let's say you get that all cooled out and you start to travel up this river. The next city you come to is like the Riviera. You still take energy in through all like this, but now you've got the survival bit cooled out, and now you're part of a species that reproduces, and you start to experience desire for sexual desire. And so the second chakra is sort of sensual gratification, the gratification of experiencing and feeling and gratifying oneself. Still, I am me separate. I can survive. Now I'll enjoy. Okay? Enjoy is the second chakra term. If you go up the river a little further, you come to a combination of Wall Street and Washington and London, which is a third chakra type place, which is primarily concerned with ego mastery, control, power. It's extensions of the self. It's no longer for survival and it's no longer for sex. It's merely for enhancement of a symbolic self. So you may perform sexual acts for power. In other words, you may now perform a sexual act in the service of the third chakra. Or you may be a businessman who's collecting power for second chakra reason, because he's doing it as a sexual potency thing. And when he buys a new huge business, he has like an orgasm of gratification, of, oh, yeah, ooh, phew, wasn't that good? Now, those first three cities include about 99% of the population. And the river gets very narrow and it changes its tone completely. They got huge steamships and jets doing the first three. But the minute you start up that fourth one, it's like a rowboat, you know, and very primitive type rowboat. And and there are big signs between 3 and 4 saying, turn back here. See? You know, we have what you want back at, you know, the Hilton Inn and the Bunny Club and the... Don't be socially irresponsible. Go no further, you know. Do good. You will feel good if you do good. Third chakra. Or before you go on, eat this. That's a good one. Or have you yet experienced, you know, Hidden Valley in southern Wyoming at 2 in the morning? But for some reason or other, some people see through the whole thing of the first three chakras. They see the kind of finiteness of the whole trip. They see that it isn't doing it, and they start up the fourth chakra. Now, up until through the third chakra, all the energy that can come out of the system only comes out through ego trips, through keeping yourself as separate. I am a finite point in time and space. First, I am protecting that finite time and point of space from you. Second, I'm going to make it with you to gratify this finite time and point in time and space. And the third one, I am going to control and master you because I'm going to feel I'm going to enhance my ego by doing that. Right? And since all of the energy, therefore, can only come out in ego manifestations of me, I will do this, I think this, my will, what I want to do. If you try, it's like the huge telephone wires that carry wires from the generating plant. They are step-down transformers and step-down transformers and step-down transformers till you finally get it into the house where you may bring it in 220 or even in 110 voltage, and at that point, that 110 is just about enough for your toaster. And if you try to feed 220, you'll burn out your toaster. Right? Well, that's the thing about ego situations. Each ego, you burn the ego out if you try to feed too much energy through it. Because each ego is like each homeowner. He can only handle the energy at such and such a level. Now, what happens to many, many people through many reasons, like they go to the Fillmore, or they go to a huge dance scene, or they go to some high energy thing like Woodstock, and they absorb through what you call a contact high. They absorb fantastic amounts of energy. It comes in a new way for them. It just comes into them. They don't eat it. It just, all their senses are information sent in through all their senses, because the first three not only allow it to come in through food, but through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. We say we get a high off, boy, look at that view, doesn't that get you high? Or listen to that sound, doesn't that turn you on? And so, at a place like Woodstock or something like that, you overload the circuits. You feed everything in all at once, see? And there's huge amount of energy. People start to tune in on vast amounts of energy. They start to go behind the step-down transformer in terms of the amount of energy that's put in. But their responses that are available to them are often just the old responses, because that's all they know what to do about it. So they try to do it more and more. So you try to make love more and more and more and more. Or you try to collect more and more power, or change the world for good. Use your power. See, you get all this power and you've got to do something about it. You eat and eat and eat until you practically explode, or you begin to see that eating is just going to go on and it's finite. See? Whatever it is. And when a certain set of prerequisites have been fulfilled, which come under the term, the word virag, meaning an end of worldliness, meaning an end of realizing that anything you're going to get in the first, second, and third chakra is really going to be enough, and that you can't use all the energy you got through those systems. You experience a despair, and then you, even though that little river gets very narrow and very
by how
absurd,
5G
it's the only
has
thing
moved
to
from
do.
the tongues of technology executives to the White House.
Setting
the
out
president
the
has
city,
talked
goodbye
about
everybody, I'll
5G
see you later, and have a good trip and report back.
countries.
You don't do it for that motive
How do you
at
see
all.
it?
Because
It's a good point.
it's
What
a
you
drag.
see
I mean,
now,
there's
given that it
mosquitoes,
is
and it's a whole draggy system compared to how groovy it can be back in the Riviera and New York or London. You do it because you begin to see the finiteness of every trip up until then, and there's nothing else to do but do it. It's the only thing you can do. Like, as long as you travel in a foreign country thinking I am traveling in a foreign country, you're a tourist, and it can't happen to you, because you're collecting photographs, tapes, and stuff which you're wearing like a coat, but it's not being absorbed because you're holding on to this core identity and the ability to surrender into a new experience, to become one with it, to merge with it, then the thing happens to you. And as long as I am somebody from London who is traveling up that river, forget it. I'm not going to make it up that river. The only way I can make it up the river is when I've given up being somebody from London, and now all I am is somebody traveling up that river, because that's the only way I can be conscious enough to see how it all is at each new stage. When you get to the fourth chakra, the anahata, in the Indian system, if you look at books, old Indian Hindu books, you'll see that the fourth through the seventh chakra is always lit by red beams that come from an om that's up in a corner in a circle like a sun, and beams are coming down from to the fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh chakra, and then there's sort of a line, and then there's a grayish place in which 1, 2, and 3 are. And the fourth chakra is the chakra of compassion. It's the chakra of grok, for those of you that are familiar with that metaphor. It's the chakra of realizing guts-wise, the brotherhood of man. It's the chakra of realizing the unitive nature of things. It's the chakra of going beyond. It's like it's Jung's chakra, really, see, because Jung was a compassionate being, and Jung, see, when you go into Jung's collective unconscious, you begin to see, just as if you go into astrology, you begin to see who you are one level back. You begin to see that you're really an Aries, just doing Aries things, or you're really a Scorpio doing Scorpio things, or that you're really part of a dominant archetype, and you're just living out your archetypal thing. You're living out your legend, if you will, and all the stuff you thought was who you were is merely sort of second-order manifestation of that, and who you are is somebody behind that, right? Now, the minute you've done that, you have freed yourself from the original identification of who you are. In other words, you're getting perspective by going up one level of who you are. So, like Tim used to say to me, my old partner, Tim Leary, used to say, dig your own legend. Now, he wasn't saying it as a big ego trip like, you enjoy your own legend, be legendary. He was saying, get out of your own predicament. If you're going to be the Jewish mother, dig that you're being the Jewish mother. Don't sit around saying, well, I've got to take care of you, I've got to cook, and I've got to sew, and I've got to, do the Jewish mother trip exquisitely, because you're conscious you are doing essence Jewish motherness. Whatever your legendary role or roles are, dig them so that you get free of getting identified with a specific instance of the set, the subset in the set, okay? To mix metaphors further. If you miss a metaphor, don't let it disturb you. 10,000 more coming up. They all say the same thing. Buddha taught for 49 years and nothing was said. Okay, so don't get frustrated. The quality of the fourth chakra is that you can break the reality boundaries you were in by talking about a limited reality as if it were absolute. And you start to get into the world of relative reality. That is, you see that there are all other realities, and you can start to look at your own life in thousands of ways. You can see yourself as woman, you can see yourself as American, you can see yourself as a religion, you can see yourself as a race, you can see yourself as a humanoid thing, you can see yourself as a biological entity, you can see yourself as an electrical chemical thing, you can see yourself as protoplasmic stuff, you can see yourself as energy transmission, you can see yourself, and it's like baklava. You look at it all, and it's just layer after layer after layer after layer, and you, oh yeah, right, of course, that too, that too, that too, that too, that too. Now, what many people do is they make a quick foray into the fourth chakra and then rush back to the third and then sell what they found. It's a very seductive possibility. Or they sell it in the second even. I mean, they sell it wherever there's a market for it. It'll give them the highest ego flash they can get. And there are many yogis who use their yogic powers in order to gain individual power. And there are many people in the Western world who use their siddhis, their powers, their spiritual powers for personal gain. Because the rational mind is a siddhi, it is a power. And you can use the power either to increase your own individual power, or you can use it to increase the consciousness of it all by turning it back inward, not using the power. The key to that whole business is not my but thy will. That's the key of submitting all of your powers, putting them in service of a process rather than stopping and taking your gains and saying, all right, I'll use them. I'll use them. See, the fourth chakra is the first chakra where one doesn't experience the feeling of separateness anymore. And waves, it's associated with waves of bliss, internal bliss. Waves of feeling of well-being. Waves of feeling of, oh yeah, that's just the way it's supposed to be. Waves of love. Waves of togetherness, of unitive feeling, of that moment of, oh yeah, here we are, that place. But most everybody has been on a very lean diet of that kind of stuff. And there are no habits of thought that allow you to be that person all the time. So you assume that you're just sort of going to take it and run, grab as much as you can. See? I'm going to get high next weekend, man, because I want to collect high. See? I want to collect high, since you are still defining yourself in third or second chakra, or first chakra. And that's still starting to try to feed 220 through 110 system. In order to define yourself now as a fourth chakra being. Okay? Like the first time you walk up to somebody and you say, I am love. Okay? Now, it is true that if you've got to say I am love, you're not. We all know that. But you're just experimenting with a new model of who you are. They say, how do you do? My name is Dave Brown. You say, how do you do? I'm love. Okay? I am God. I am pure spirit. I am part of all of us. And they say, oh, yeah, I know, but who are you? Okay? And then you immediately go back into the thing that you really thought, well, really, I'm Dick Alpert. What do you do? Or I'm into what I'm Ram Dass. So. Every time you experience that feeling of unity, then all of the personal time, space, desires, and attachments are no longer relevant at that moment. It's like if my body needs something, it all gets taken care of one way or another, but I don't sit around desiring it because I've now identified with a much broader kind of phenomenal field, if you will, who I am. I am the universe. Only under those conditions can you use higher energy, because then you aren't using the energy. Then there's no blockage, there's no tension, there's no feeling I got to do something, because there's no you to do it anymore. Fifth chakra is the chakra that is connected with Ramakrishna, is the one that we most associated with. It's a tremendous pull towards God. It's a tremendous pull towards turning inward and upward. Ramakrishna characteristically talked, most of the Ramakrishna stories are fourth and fifth intertwining. He would go from loving the Divine Mother in all her forms, which is compassion, fourth chakra, to turning inward to go into that which was behind the Divine Mother inside, higher, into merging with one. And sometimes I've told about how he'd say, get me tobacco, and they'd say, but you don't smoke. He'd say, well, I got to want something, or I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave my body. I got to have something to hold me down. I got to have a desire to keep me in the fourth chakra, or to keep me down into a body which is even below that. And when you see people who are called God intoxicants or masts in India, these are people who are in the fifth chakra. Their concern for their body, their concern for everything has fallen away. They're still on the journey into oneness, but they are at a stage on the river where all the mail that comes gets sent back saying dead letter office. A letter from London never gets there to the fifth chakra. And Ramana Maharshi, for example, becomes enlightened at 17, and then he goes off to the mountain Arunachala, and he sits in a cave, and kids are throwing rocks and feces and everything at him, and he's just like completely oblivious to it all. And then somebody comes along and they see this very high being, and they carry him to another place, and they try to feed him like a couple of grains of rice a day and pour milk in, and nothing's happening. He's just completely out of it, because he's in the fifth chakra. In our categorization, we often call these people catatonic schizophrenics. We got to be careful, because some of them are catatonic schizophrenics in the old terms, and some of them are these God intoxicants. But we don't have any discrimination in our system at all. So they're all put in total care institutions, which is a groovy place to keep them while they're doing their work. Then there is the possibility of sixth chakra, which is the ajna. The fifth chakra is right down here in the throat. The sixth chakra is right here between the eyebrows. It's when thine eye becomes single, you will see it all. That's the sixth chakra, the single eye. And it's the eye of wisdom. It's the point of causal plane. It's the point when you're in the sixth chakra, when you've traveled up that far, you understand and know and are wise about all of the laws of the universe. You see how it all works. You are the Godhead at that point. You are the mind that creates all the laws of the universe. You are one with it all. You see just how it is, but you're still busy seeing how it all is. Okay, there's still a separateness. And it's only when you go into the seventh chakra, the thousand-petal lotus, that you come into total merging back into what's called the Param Brahma, or back into that which is behind all form. Those are the seven systems, 7 levels. You can do any system, you can do any yoga at any one of the levels. I see people do hatha yoga work on their bodies, and I see them do it for sexual gratification or sensual gratification because it feels so good to do hatha yoga. Feels so good to be able to do these far-out things with their body. I see them do it for third chakra because they get mastery and power and control over the environment, and they develop powers. I see them do it in fourth chakra as an act of compassionate service, keeping the temple going to keep themselves as high as possible to serve, not in the ego sense, just serve. A person in the fifth chakra, were he doing hatha yoga, wouldn't know he was doing hatha yoga. It would just be hatha yoga was being done, like going to the toilet being done. And so on up, it's irrelevant. Now that's to say to you that every part of the yoga that I describe, of which we're really talking about it now, every part of the yoga that I describe, you can do at many, many, many levels. Take bhakti, singing love songs to God. You can do bhakti, or you can do, that kind of thing. See? And you can say, wow, isn't that groovy sound? Let's all sing together, like sing along with Mitch type thing. You can do it as a kind of a collective, emotional, fun experience. You can do it as a pure exercise in one-pointedness, at a much higher level. By Ram, 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 and then you go right out through Ram. You can do it at a third chakra thing to say, look how good I am, I'm singing, love songs to God. Now, who we are in the West is all these levels all at once. Freud describes us as second chakra people. Adler describes us as third chakra people. Jung describes us as fourth chakra people. Teilhard de Chardin, people like that start to describe us in sixth chakra terms. The Egyptians describe us in sixth chakra terms. Most of us are functioning at many of these levels. We have moments of fourth chakra, we have dominant third or dominant second, we have moments of sixth, and our job, as we see it, we are in an evolutionary process of slowly moving up the spine, moving up these chakras, so that more and more of the energy and habits and whole way of life get localized in one chakra rather than another. That is, you do the survival thing till you got survival in order. You do the sex thing until you got the sex thing in harmony. You do the power thing until you got the power thing in harmony. You do compassion until that's in harmony. And you just keep moving through center after center after center and building models of who you are in terms of each of these new levels. Like Golding's Lord of the Flies is a beautiful example of when the kids are left alone, they go back into first chakra. Straight first chakra story. Now, if they all go through pubescence, then it'll become a straight second chakra story. Not because they, just because they're now, something's happened inside of them and they're ready for the second chakra. Then they build an organized structure, an environment, an organization, and then they elect a president, and then pretty soon they're in a third chakra term. And then when they use up worldliness, they start to be interested in fourth chakra. And so you can see Man is just an unfolding process of these chakras. And the chakras are right inside your own body. Your tuning device are your own chakras. So that as you tune in to each new chakra in your body, you tune in to a whole new universe, a whole new level of perceiving how it all is. It's like you take sex, take the sexual act. The sexual act can be done by a second chakra person, as it most often is, in which I lust for you, you are object, I make it with you, and through that vehicle I get gratification, and one of the gratifications is the great wave of bliss that comes at the moment of orgasm. But you notice, except for at the moment of orgasm, the entire method is based on duality. It's based on the idea that I'm separate and you're separate, and we're doing it for our mutual pleasure. But we're still separate beings. Now, what would it mean for fourth chakra people to make love? How would they do it? What would it be about? Who do you make love with? If everybody's the same person, who are you making love with? Does it mean that making love becomes an anachronism? I mean, is it all used up? Don't people make love? Well, the first thing that you've got to see and to try to feel your way into is that the experience, the highest experience you make love in order to reach, is where you live when you are in the fourth chakra. Okay? In other words, if you just drank your fill and then somebody comes along and says, how would you like a nice cold glass of water? The process of drinking the water doesn't do anything to you any longer, because you already are the water. You've done what you need to do. It's already here. So then, if you already are experiencing the goal of what the means was, why would you do the means anymore? The means takes on a new significance at that point. That's where Gandhi says, at the point of the real concept meaning of brahmachari, which is what I am, is not that I am sexually continent. It just means that I can have sex when I can have it in the fourth chakra. But then the question is, why would I have sex? And the answer is, I would have sex in order to reproduce children. Because I wouldn't be having it for gratification, since I already have the gratification I'd be having sex in order to get. See, I used to think about these yogis that would sit up in the mountains all by themselves all day, and I think these poor cats, man, they don't really dig how beautiful it all can be if they make it and have a home and hearth and, the whole scene. Till I began to realize that as individuals, they were experiencing exactly that same thing that everybody was trying to collect all the time. Except they had figured out that the thing they were trying to collect was something they already are, and they learned how to be it, and then they were just sitting being it. Well, now, does that mean that everybody, the minute they get to the fourth chakra, just sits in a mountaintop? And what happens to the world, and what happens to population, and do people produce, and why do they, and so on? If you sit down with your beloved, with your partner, with your Shakti, with your Shiva, with the yin and yang of it, and the two of you recognize the place in you where there is only one of you, and simultaneously acknowledge the place where there are two of you, then the act of making love is at the same moment an act of working from within oneself, and simultaneously it's an experience between two people. So when you sit down opposite your partner, cross-legged, and look directly into their eyes, and what you see is a face, and the face looks desirable to you, that's duality. And you look, and your face simultaneously is looking desirable to the other person. I can tell you that. And then you say, yes, and that one too. And then you just keep looking directly into their eyes, and then the face changes again. And then you see somebody that's very repugnant to you. And they see somebody that's very repugnant to them, and you say, yeah, and that one too. And then you see somebody that is childlike. I've told this story before. It may be helpful to see what I'm talking about taking LSD with Ronnie Lang in London. And he's a psychiatrist. And Ronnie and I took LSD, and then Ronnie came over to me, and he looked at me when we got high. He looked at me as if he were an old, wise, kind, good, protective father. And the minute I saw him looking that way, I felt like a defenseless little child, just embraced by his protectiveness. And the minute I had let myself totally into that one, his face changed and he became the most defenseless little child. And when I saw this poor, pathetic, defenseless little child, out of me came this fantastic feeling of protective, old, wise, kind father. And the minute I had just gotten comfortable in that role, I'll take care of you, Ronnie. It's okay. I know what it must be like for you. His face changed again. And he was a fellow adventurer on a great journey. And into my face came the feeling of, wow, we're really journeying together. Did you see what we just did? See? Isn't this an exciting journey? And here we were having an exciting, all silently, all in meme, all in just faces and bodies. And on and on and on we went for 4 or 5, 6 hours, just going through role change after role change after role change. And that one too.
Before we go into those questions, may I comment on something? People have been talking a great deal about the art, about what is art. I believe the root meaning of that word is to put everything in its proper place. Can we talk a little bit about that first? What do you think is the greatest art, the supreme art? Is it the art of listening, the art of seeing, observing, perceiving, and so on, and the art of learning, the art of hearing, the art of seeing, the art of learning. And what do we mean by seeing, observing, perceiving? I'm asking. Please, together we are investigating into these questions. Not that the speaker is talking to himself. We are talking over together these questions, these issues that are confronting almost everywhere you go. We'll have to wait. So let's begin with the art of hearing. We not only hear with the ears, words conveyed, vibrated, and so on to the brain, and surely it's much more than that. The art of hearing something, like a child who listens to a very good story. He's consumed by the story. He's completely involved with the hero or the heroine. He's excited, he's listening. Do we ever listen? We can't do anything, I'm afraid. Do you ever listen to anybody? Do you listen to your wife or husband or your girlfriend? Really listen to what they are conveying, trying to say something? Or do we translate what is being said into our own terminology, comparing with what we already know, judging, evaluating, agreeing, disagreeing, the whole movement that goes on when you listen to another? Is that listening? The speaker is talking now, unfortunately. And are we listening? Actually paying attention to the words, to the meaning of words, to the content of words, not translating, comparing, judging, agreeing, just listening. Are we doing that now? And isn't that one of the most important things? How, in what manner we listen to another. The other may be wearing too strong a perfume, and you are repelled by it, or you like it. And in this like and dislike of a perfume or other factors may prevent one from listening. Listening to what the other person has to say. If you have gone into this question rather deeply, you'll find it's one of the most difficult things to listen to another completely. Are we doing that now? Or we are fidgety and so on. So there is an art to listening, right? And there is an art to learn. No, the art of seeing, the art of hearing, the art of seeing. Seeing things as they are. When you look at a tree, do you translate it immediately into words and say, tree? Or do you look at it perceive it, see the shape of it, see the beauty of the light on a leaf, see the quality of the tree. It's not man-made, fortunately. It's there. So, do we see ourselves as we are, without condemnation, without judgment, evaluation, and so on, just to see what we are, our reactions and responses, our prejudices, opinions, just to see them, that we indulge ourselves in opinions. Not to do anything about it, but just to observe it. Right? Can we do it? So there is an art of seeing things as they are, without naming, without being caught in the network of words. The whole operation of thinking, interfering with perception. That's a great art. And also, there is an art of learning. Isn't there? And what do we mean by learning? Generally, it is understood that learning means memorizing, accumulating, storing up, to use what you have stored up skillfully or not. That's generally called learning, memorizing. School, college, university, or some technological subject, or learning a language, reading, writing, communicating, and so on. The modern computers can do all that better than we can. They're extraordinarily rapid. Right? So what's the difference between us and the computer? I'm asking you. That's learning, being programmed. We've also been programmed in various ways. Tradition, so-called culture, knowledge, so on. We're also being programmed to be Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Tibetan, and all the rest of it, communist, and so on. Is learning that's all? Just memorizing, repeating? Is that learning? We are questioning, we're not saying that's not. It's necessary to learn how to drive a car. It's necessary to learn a language, if you're interested in languages. And so on. And we're asking, is all that learning? Or is learning something much more? Are we together in this? Don't just look at me, please. Tell. The person is not very interesting. We're asking something that is learning merely memorizing? And if that's all, then computer can do better than us. And isn't learning something much more? Learning means constantly learning, not accumulating, not gathering in what one has seen, what one has observed, heard, learned, and storing it up. Learning means, to the speaker, a constant observation, listening, moving, never taking a stand, never taking a position, never going back to memory and let memory act. Right? That's a great art. And the art of discipline. That word means to learn. It comes from the root disciple, one who learns from someone else. Not necessarily from the teacher, from the guru. They are generally rather stupid. But to discipline oneself according to a pattern, like a soldier, like a monk, like a person who wants to be very austere, disciplines his body. You understand? The whole process of control, direction, obedience, subservience, and train yourself. That's generally understood to be discipline. To me, discipline, to the speaker, is a terrible thing. Because if you know how to, if there is acute hearing, not only by the ear, but also deeply listening to yourself, to everything that's happening, to listen to the birds, to the river, to the forest, to the mount. You follow? Listening. And observing the minutest insect on the floor, if you can see it, if you've got good eyes. And learning. All that constitutes a form of living, which in itself becomes the discipline. Not that there is a person who disciplines himself, but a constant movement. This is the art of living, in which there is no conflict whatsoever. So that where there is conflict, that conflict numbs the brain, destroys the brain. By this great art of living, it is free. And in that freedom, you don't need discipline. There's constantly movement, right? I'll go back to the questions.